Hello everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. If you enjoy our content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Today, we're going to be discussing the film Sulih Suara, Tragedi Serangan Hiu Raksasa, nonton online. The air hung thick and salty around Amity Island, a picture postcard of New England charm that belied the churning anxieties beneath its surface. We meet Chief Martin Brody, a man whose past we sense is rooted firmly in the concrete canyons of a city, perhaps New York, where the water was something to be avoided, not embraced. Now he's trying to adapt to this sleepy coastal community, a transition made difficult by his inherent unease with the ocean, a classic case of the transplanted urbanite confronting nature's raw indifference. His wife, Ellen, tries to bridge the gap, but the real tension surfaces when a young woman's late-night swim ends in a brutal, unseen attack. Brody, ever the cautious administrator, immediately wants the beaches closed. He envisions headlines, lawsuits, the end of the lucrative summer season. But Mayor Larry Vaughn, a man whose entire identity seems tied to the success of the tourist trade, waves away the concerns. Vaughn, perhaps accustomed to the minor skirmishes of local politics, treats the incident as a regrettable accident, an unfortunate, isolated event. His denial is palpable, thick with the smell of tanning lotion and impending profit. Then the second attack comes, this time claiming a local man who, ironically, had been exploring the wreckage of a sunken vessel nearby, perhaps seeking forgotten treasures, or simply a thrill. This escalates things beyond mere rumor. Brody finds an unlikely ally in Matt Hooper, a young, sharp, and incredibly wealthy oceanographer. Hooper represents the intellectual, scientific approach. He's eager, equipped with the latest sonar equipment, and bursting with academic fervor, having likely studied marine biology at an institution so prestigious it doesn't need naming. He knows what they are dealing with, a great white, a perfect massive predator. Brody and Hooper push for immediate action, but Vaughn remains resistant, fearing bad press more than bad consequences. He commissions a shark hunter, Quint, a character who steps out of a different era entirely. Quint is the embodiment of grizzled sea lore, a man who speaks in nautical metaphors and carries the scars of past battles, real or imagined, with the sea. His famous monologue about the sinking of the Indianapolis isn't just storytelling, it's a psychological profile etched in trauma, revealing a man who believes he understands the ocean's malice because he's looked into its abyss before. His boat, the Orca, is a beautiful, battered relic, a testament to a time when men fought sea monsters with harpoons rather than sensors. When the first tangible evidence, a massive, jagged tooth, is presented, Vaughn is finally forced to concede. The beaches are closed, but the damage is done. Hooper, driven by his scientific imperative, mounts an underwater cage expedition, wanting to document the beast. This initial foray proves that their preparation, while sophisticated, is still insufficient against true instinct. The shark demolishes the cage, nearly claiming Hooper, confirming that this is not just an animal, it's a force of nature made flesh, impervious to their modern protections. Brody, realizing the official response is inadequate, pressures Vaughn one last time, leading to the inevitable confrontation. The three men, the reluctant cop, the passionate scientist, and the vengeful hunter, set out on the Orca. The ensuing voyage is a masterclass in escalating tension. Quint, fueled by rum and resentment toward the shark, steers them further from shore, intentionally escalating the hunt into a personal vendetta. Hooper, though knowledgeable, becomes increasingly frustrated by Quint's almost superstitious approach. Brody, caught between these two extremes, suffers from seasickness and a growing sense of dread. The inevitable encounter is terrifying. The shark is revealed not as a CGI spectacle, but as a looming, utterly massive presence that dwarfs their vessel. It picks apart the orca with chilling efficiency, treating their efforts like a child toys with blocks. Quint's bravado cracks under the reality of the monster. His initial confidence dissolves into panicked rage. In a desperate final act, recalling the lessons of the Indianapolis, Quint attempts to dispatch the shark with a depth charge, only to be snatched from the deck, disappearing in the churning water, a grim confirmation of the ocean's ultimate authority. It falls to Brody, the outsider who always knew the danger was real, to finish it. Stripped of the specialized equipment and the archaic weaponry, he relies on primal instinct and the few tools left at hand. Remembering the need to strike where the beast is vulnerable, he finally uses the one weapon they thought wouldn't be necessary, a high-powered rifle loaded with explosive rounds, aiming for the maw. The resulting explosion sends blood into the water, a gruesome punctuation mark to the terror. As they drift back toward Amity, Brody and Hooper, the unlikely survivors, watch the water, knowing that while this specific chapter is closed, the ocean holds countless other indifferent secrets. Brody, gazing back at the fading shoreline, has finally earned his place on the island, not as a guest, but as one who has faced its deepest shadows and lived to tell the tale. The salt spray seemed to cling to Chief Brody's khaki uniform like a persistent accusation. He was a man built for the grid system, for the predictable chaos of city life, not the boundless, untamed expanse that now defined his existence on Amity Island. His anxiety wasn't just about the shark. It was about the loss of control, the constant reminder that nature, unlike city zoning laws, refused to be managed. Ellen, his wife, carried the weight of his unspoken fears, her attempts at domestic normalcy, a fragile shield against the encroaching primal threat. The opening death, that bright summer moment shattered by crimson streaks in the turquoise water, felt to Brody like a personal failure, a bureaucratic oversight he couldn't correct with a memo. Mayor Vaughn, whose smile seemed permanently affixed for the Chamber of Commerce photo ops, operated on a pure, unadulterated faith in the almighty dollar. He wasn't malicious, perhaps, just deeply insulated by his privilege and the endless stream of tourist dollars that lubricated his vision of Amity. To him, the ocean was a backdrop for profitable recreation, not a hunting ground. When the second victim, a local exploring the sunken anonymity of the seabed, was taken, Vaughn's denial hardened into obstinance. He was protecting an illusion, a summer economy built on willful ignorance. Enter Matt Hooper. He arrived smelling faintly of laboratory formaldehyde and wealth, his youthful enthusiasm almost grating against Brody's weary cynicism. Hooper, we understand, likely honed his observational skills studying the delicate ecosystems of coral reefs or deep-sea trenches, his mind sharp and trained to recognize patterns. He saw the shark not as a monster, but as a biological anomaly demanding documentation, perhaps viewing the hunt as a necessary field exercise. His eagerness to confront the beast head-on with technology, sonar pings echoing uselessly into the deep, was the scientist challenging the ancient mystery with modern tools. Then there was Quint. He wasn't a man who arrived. He was a man who materialized out of the brine and diesel fumes of the docks. His skin looked cured by decades of sun and wind, and his eyes held the weary wisdom of someone who had survived things others only read about in cautionary tales. Quint's association with the Indianapolis wasn't a career footnote. It was the crucible that forged his worldview. He didn't just fear the shark. He recognized an ancient kinship of survival with it, seeing the great white as a peer, a worthy antagonist in the eternal war between man and the indifferent deep. His command of the Orca, a vessel lovingly maintained yet visibly aged, symbolized his philosophy: rely on grit and muscle over circuits and glass. When Hooper presented the massive tooth, a fragment of undeniable, terrifying reality, the veneer finally cracked on Vaughn's administration. Yet the attempt to contain the threat scientifically, with Hooper's reinforced cage descending into the murky depths, was an act of profound hubris. The shark's casual dismantling of the steel apparatus, a sound surely akin to tinfoil crumpling to Hooper, was the moment the balance shifted completely. Science had underestimated pure, predatory focus. The formation of the hunting trio aboard the Orca was a fragile alliance built on mutual necessity. Brody, whose stomach perpetually churned from the rolling deck and the underlying dread, became the weary mediator. Hooper, the intellectual, grew increasingly agitated, watching Quint eschew methodical tracking for aggressive, almost spiritual provocation. Quint, meanwhile, seemed to be conducting a final, fatal ceremony, drawing the beast out not just to kill it, but to avenge every man the sea had ever claimed from him. The cramped quarters magnified their differences, the air thick with unspoken resentments and the growing realization of their own insignificance against the vastness they sailed upon. The actual appearance of the great white was not a jump scare. It was an overwhelming environmental event. It wasn't just large, it was monolithic, absorbing light, dwarfing their little world on the waves. When it struck the hull, the sound was less a collision and more a confirmation of structural failure. Quint's final, desperate lunge toward the water, harpoon in hand, wasn't heroism. It was the tragic fulfillment of his life's narrative, a challenge issued to the abyss that was instantly, brutally accepted. Brody, left with Hooper, adrift in the wreckage of their specialized skills, reverted to something more fundamental. He was the man who had feared the water most, and now, stripped of bureaucracy and technology, he had to become the most primal survivor. That final explosive shot was less about skill and more about sheer, desperate necessity. A final, loud declaration against the silence of the deep. As they limped back toward the distant, fragile lights of Amity, Brody and Hooper shared a silent understanding. They had survived the legend, but the ocean remained, vast and utterly uncaring, ready to swallow the next unsuspecting dreamer. Brody, though physically safe, was now permanently marked by the encounter, forever bonded to the untamed, terrifying heart of the sea. The return to Amity was not a triumphant homecoming, but a weary crawl back to civilization, the salt drying on Brody's face like a mask of experience. The sight of the quaint, sun-drenched docks, usually a source of comfort for the townsfolk, now felt dangerously fragile, a thin veneer of human order laid over an ancient, chaotic reality. Hooper, ever the pragmatist despite his near-death experience, would immediately turn his focus to salvage and documentation, probably already sketching diagrams in his mind for reinforced submersibles and better tracking algorithms, a man determined to outsmart nature through superior data collection. He carried the quiet, simmering frustration of a scholar whose prized specimen had destroyed his laboratory. Brody, however, felt a deeper, more visceral change. He hadn't just killed a shark, he had faced the embodiment of his own internalized fears, about the environment he had tried so hard to ignore since moving to the coast. He walked onto the dock not as the chief of police seeking commendation, but as a man who had just stared into an abyss and seen his reflection. The townsfolk, initially relieved the terror was over, would likely look at him with a mixture of gratitude and lingering suspicion. They wanted their summer back, the illusion of safety restored, but Brody now carried the knowledge that such illusions were mortal, easily punctured by a 7,000-pound force of nature. Ellen would meet him, her relief tempered by the stark realization of what her husband had endured, the unspoken acknowledgement that their life in this idyllic setting would never again feel truly safe. The summer was over, not because the season had ended, but because the fundamental contract between man and ocean had been violently renegotiated. The silence that followed the chaos would be the loudest sound on Amity Island, punctuated only by the gentle, deceptive lapping of the waves, forever carrying the memory of the orca's splintered hull and Quint's final, watery scream. The quiet that settled over Amity after their agonizing return was a deceptive thing, thick as mud and far harder to navigate than the open ocean had been. Brody, stepping onto the familiar wooden planks of the pier, felt every eye upon him, not just the gaze of the townspeople relieved that the immediate threat was gone, but the judging scrutiny of a community grappling with its own shattered complacency. He carried the stench of diesel, dried blood, and salt water like a uniform he couldn't shed, a stark contrast to the crisp linens and neat uniforms of his previous, more manageable life. For Brody, the victory was hollow. He knew the statistics would be massaged, the official report would gloss over Quint's near madness, and the sheer luck involved in the final kill. He had won a battle against a creature, but the war against the sea's indifference was eternal, and he felt acutely the cost of that small, explosive triumph. Hooper, meanwhile, was already on the periphery of the immediate drama, his mind racing ahead to the aftermath. He was busy making calls, likely to his university contacts or perhaps private marine research facilities, securing equipment for a proper recovery operation, not just of the shark's remains, but perhaps even seeking any recognizable debris from the orca. Hooper possessed the resilience of pure intellect. For him, the trauma was data, and the data needed collection and analysis. He saw Brody's haunted expression and likely offered a sympathetic, if slightly distant, nod. His drive wasn't rooted in vengeance like Quint's, but in the scientific imperative to catalog, understand, and ultimately minimize risk through knowledge. He represented the future of confronting such threats, methodical, prepared, and heavily funded, a direct rebuttal to Quint's antiquated heroism. Ellen's embrace on the shore was tight, perhaps too tight, as if she were trying to physically re-anchor her husband to the land, to the world of domestic predictability he had fled and then terrifyingly returned to. She saw the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his eyes constantly scanned the water's edge, no longer looking at the surface, but beyond it, into the hidden depths. They would try to talk, late at night, over lukewarm coffee. But the language of what happened out there, the sheer, overwhelming presence of the predator, was a language only he and Hooper truly spoke. The town itself would quickly revert, as coastal communities often do when the immediate danger passes. Vaughn would be working overtime, not to mourn the dead, but to craft narratives that minimize the severity, ensuring the summer bookings for the following year remained high. He would paint Brody as the necessary, if perhaps overly dramatic, instrument of salvation. But for Brody, the island had become tainted. Every perfect sunset was now merely the prelude to darkness, every gentle wave a potential carrier of menace. He had been forced to recognize the true nature of his new home, a beautiful facade masking a raw, unforgiving wilderness. The irony was profound. The city man who feared water had to destroy a piece of that wildness to earn his peace. But that peace was perpetually conditional, resting on the hope that the ocean would remain asleep just a little while longer. The quiet descending upon Amity felt less like peace and more like a brief, exhausted pause between acts of a very large, very indifferent play. Brody, standing slightly apart from the welcoming committee that Mayor Vaughn had hastily assembled, a collection of grim-faced town elders and anxious business owners, felt the weight of his exhaustion settle deep into his bones. He wasn't interested in the forced smiles or the murmured thanks. He was preoccupied with the smell of Quint's residual brine and the phantom sensation of the orca lurching beneath his feet. His role had shifted overnight from reluctant local law enforcement to reluctant folk hero, a mantle he found itchy and entirely undeserved. He knew that every successful season after this would be attributed, in part, to the terror he had faced, conveniently forgetting the cost paid by the hunter and the sheer, terrifying luck that saved him and Hooper. Hooper, meanwhile, had already slipped into his element of controlled crisis management. He wasn't mingling. He was pacing the perimeter of the dock, his expensive deck shoes now scuffed and permanently stained. He was likely already framing the necessary paperwork for insurance claims and preliminary environmental impact assessments. Hooper's inspiration always stemmed from a desire for mastery through understanding. He probably wasn't dreaming of revenge, but of the perfect telemetry system that could have tracked that beast from miles out, rendering Quint's antiquated methods obsolete before they ever left the harbor. He viewed Brody with a kind of sober respect, acknowledging the chief's necessary descent into primal action, but knowing that the true solution lay in superior engineering and marine science, a perspective born from lecture halls and sophisticated laboratories, far removed from the brutal reality of the open sea. Ellen watched her husband navigate this strange, sudden celebrity with a tightening in her chest. She saw the man who used to meticulously check the locks on their suburban doors, now constantly scanning the horizon, his gaze unnervingly empty. Their conversations, when they finally managed to have them in the privacy of their home, were fractured. She spoke of grocery lists and school schedules. He spoke, often unconsciously, of water pressure and the sound a steel hull makes when it's being systematically torn apart. The intimacy they shared now felt conditional, contingent on whether Brody could manage to exorcise the shadow of the great white from his mind before it consumed him entirely. He had become a stranger, dressed in his own skin, a man forever imprinted by the vastness he had so desperately tried to keep at bay. The townspeople, sensing the danger had temporarily retreated, began the crucial process of collective memory editing. Vaughn would ensure that the narrative emphasized the town's ultimate strength, the quick mobilization, and the swift removal of the threat. They needed the illusion of control to sell beachfront rentals. Brody was useful as a symbol of decisive action, but his underlying unease, his constant suggestion that the beast was just one of many lurking dangers, was inconvenient. He would be celebrated, then quietly marginalized, as the town rushed back toward the sun-drenched fiction of invincibility. Brody understood this dance. He had done his job, and now the community was ready to forget the ugly details of how that job was accomplished, eager to resume its comfortable, profitable ignorance about the true nature of the sea surrounding them. The air, though no longer thick with immediate panic, remained heavy with unspoken truths about human vulnerability. Brody's decision, as the dust settled and the initial adrenaline ebbed, was perhaps the most telling commentary on his ordeal. He didn't resign immediately, which would have been the understandable flight of a man seeking refuge inland. Instead, he lingered, a wounded sentinel guarding a fortress he no longer believed in. This persistence spoke volumes about the professional ethics drilled into him during his time in metropolitan law enforcement, a deeply ingrained sense of duty that warred daily with his overwhelming psychological exhaustion. He remained chief, not out of desire, but out of a grim realization that if he left, Mayor Vaughn would install someone far more pliable, someone who would actively suppress any whispers of the sea's dangers for the sake of the next fiscal quarter. Brody stayed, therefore, as a necessary, albeit deeply unhappy, counterweight to the town's inherent denial. Hooper, conversely, was already looking toward the horizon, metaphorically and literally. His next moves were clearly about leveraging this catastrophic event into funding for deeper, more robust research, perhaps even campaigning for the establishment of a permanent, officially recognized marine monitoring station off the coast. The scientist in him saw the tragedy as an opportunity to force infrastructure upgrades and regulatory oversight. He likely saw Quint's death not as a personal loss, but as a cautionary tale against relying on outdated, emotionally driven hunting techniques. His eventual departure from Amity wouldn't be marked by fanfare. He would simply leave one day to present his findings at a major symposium, carrying with him the data that confirmed humanity's continued precarious position in the marine food chain. His connection to Brody would remain, a silent acknowledgement between two men who had shared a baptism by fire. But their worlds, the world of measured variables and the world of gut instinct, would remain fundamentally separate. The town's attempts to return to normalcy were almost comical in their frantic energy. Beach umbrellas sprouted like defiant, colorful mushrooms overnight. The local diner, which had been deserted during the height of the panic, buzzed with gossip, reinterpreting the attack as an anomaly caused by unusual currents or perhaps even foreign interference, anything but the natural behavior of the ocean's apex predator. Brody noticed the subtle ways people avoided his gaze when discussing the incident, as if his very presence was a pollutant that spoiled the idyllic view. He saw children pointing at the water, not with fear, but with a morbid curiosity fueled by sensationalized playground rumors, a new perverse generation already acclimatized to the idea of hidden monsters. For Brody and Ellen, their home, once a symbol of their successful escape from urban claustrophobia, became a psychological trap. Brody would find himself standing on the porch at night, not looking for intruders, but listening to the rhythm of the tide. He wasn't seeking Quint's vengeful shark. He was listening for the next one, the one that might not be so easily provoked or dispatched. His past as a city cop had taught him that danger always reappeared in a new disguise. He had traded the predictable violence of human society for the unpredictable, silent vastness of nature. And in doing so, he had only exchanged one form of vigilance for another. His eventual peace, if it ever came, would not be found in forgetting, but in the difficult, ongoing commitment to respecting the untamed power he now knew lay just beyond the sand. The lingering presence of the orca, or rather the ghost of its splintered wreckage, continued to haunt Brody's periphery. It wasn't just the physical absence of Quint and his rugged vessel that gnawed at him. It was the vacuum left by Quint's particular brand of primal certitude. Now only the cool, rational analysis of Hooper remained, and while Brody respected the science, it felt insufficient against the raw, irrational terror the shark had embodied. Brody found himself relying on an internalized, almost superstitious sense of watchfulness, a necessary regression from the structured world of police procedure. He started taking unscheduled, solitary patrols along the furthest stretches of the beach in his Jeep, often late at night, his floodlight cutting shallow, tentative paths into the black water. A ritual born not of official duty, but of a profound, personal vow to the slain. Ellen, observing this transformation, grew quieter. Her attempts to create domestic normalcy felt increasingly like dressing a wound with silk, beautiful but ultimately ineffective against the underlying infection. She understood that her husband was now permanently keyed to a different frequency of threat. Their arguments, when they occurred, weren't about trivialities. They were about the reality of their shared existence. She might argue for a vacation, a trip back to the familiar, solid ground of the city, but Brody couldn't leave. Leaving meant abandoning the shoreline to its own devices, admitting that the chaos was too great to manage, and that admission was a concession to defeat he couldn't yet afford. He was tethered to Amity now, not by affection for the town, but by the grim responsibility of having seen the monster up close. Hooper, after securing the necessary permits and perhaps a modest salvage agreement for the orca's remains, likely viewing the recovery of Quint's harpoons as crucial evidence, began his transition back to academia. He probably left Amity with a sense of intellectual victory, having proven his theories correct, albeit at a terrible cost. His final interactions with Brody would be characterized by mutual exhaustion and professional regard. Hooper would offer advice on better warning systems, perhaps even send Brody brochures for advanced maritime distress signaling equipment, framing safety in terms of technological upgrades. Brody would accept them politely, knowing that no sonar or satellite tracking could ever prepare a person for the moment a colossal, silent shadow surfaces directly beneath you. The unspoken understanding between the two survivors was that they inhabited two different worlds now. Hooper would return to lecture halls, where the shark was a fascinating case study, a data point in marine ecology. Brody, however, would remain on the ground in the humid, salty air of Amity, where the shark was a recurring nightmare, a potential reality lurking behind every wave break. The closure the town sought was superficial. The closure Brody sought was internal, and he knew it would take years of sleepless nights and endless vigilance to achieve anything resembling peace. He was the keeper of the island's terrible secret, forever listening for the deep, rumbling breath of the ocean's largest resident, hoping against hope that the explosion had been final. The town's forced return to festivity felt like a shallow, frantic covering of rot. Mayor Vaughn, ever the master of optics, orchestrated a series of small, highly publicized events. A community resilience day, perhaps, or an early, overly enthusiastic opening of the main beach, all designed to inject capital and confidence back into the local economy. Brody watched these displays with a detached weariness, recognizing the desperate performance for what it was, a collective agreement to forget the physical evidence of chaos. The mayor treated Brody like a valuable if slightly unstable piece of municipal property to be displayed when necessary, but otherwise kept safely out of sight, lest his haunted demeanor spoil the sun-drenched facade. Brody's personal battles were now entirely internal, waged during the long, silent watches in his chief's office, the sound of the nearby surf a constant, maddening metronome. He found himself scrutinizing old maritime charts, not for potential shark habitats, but for escape routes, a subconscious planning for a catastrophe that he knew, logically, might never repeat itself. His relationship with Ellen became less about shared life and more about shared tension. She became hypersensitive to the slightest sound of the ocean, while he developed a strange, morbid fascination with it. He started reading obscure marine biology journals Hooper had sent, not to learn how to hunt better, but to understand the sheer indifference of the creature, the lack of malice, which was far more terrifying than hatred. The true tragedy, Brody realized, was the loss of Quint. Hooper had the intellect to move on, and Brody had the responsibility to stay. But Quint had been utterly consumed by his singular narrative, a narrative that the ocean had tragically concluded on its own terms. Brody occasionally found himself wishing for the grizzled hunter's presence, not for his skills, but for his unwavering, if suicidal, conviction. Quint had understood the ocean's indifference and embraced the necessity of a direct, human confrontation, a purity of purpose. Brody, the bureaucrat turned warrior, could never fully attain. The final, lingering echo of the event was the realization that his tenure on Amity was unsustainable. He could patrol, he could warn, but he could not change the fundamental nature of the sea, nor the fundamental desire of the townsfolk to ignore it. He was stuck in a purgatory, too deeply involved to walk away cleanly, yet too damaged to fully embrace the role of protector. The only thing that gave him a measure of grim satisfaction was knowing that every local fisherman who now looked out at the water might share a flicker of his own recent terror. The monster had been killed, yes, but the respect, the fear it had inspired might, just for a little while, keep Amity safe in a way Mayor Vaughn's optimistic brochures never could. It was a perverse form of peace, bought with blood and trauma, but it was the only kind he had earned. The seasons, in their slow, relentless turning, began to obscure the sharp edges of the attack, but the internal landscape of Chief Brody remained scarred and perpetually overcast. He found a perverse comfort in the encroaching autumn chill, as the cooler air seemed to push the frivolous, sun-worshipping crowds and their inherent blindness back toward the mainland. The beach was emptier now, the sand damp and unforgiving, mirroring the state of his own spirit. He started drinking his morning coffee, standing on the back deck, not looking at the houses or the manicured lawns, but straight out to the churning gray expanse, engaging in a silent, ongoing standoff with the horizon. Ellen, seeing his deepening isolation, tried one last, poignant appeal. She suggested they take a short trip inland, perhaps upstate, somewhere surrounded by hills and forests where the water was contained in clear, manageable lakes. The very thought of leaving the ocean seemed to frighten Brody more than staying near it. He explained, his voice raspy from disuse, that if he left, the town would fall back into its easy complacency, and the death of Quint, the sacrifice, would be rendered meaningless. It wasn't just duty holding him, it was a form of penance. He felt he hadn't just killed the shark. He had been privileged to witness a primal truth, and now he was burdened with its memory, unable to comfortably exist in a world that insisted on forgetting. Hooper, true to form, maintained a sporadic but significant correspondence. His letters were updates disguised as intellectual missives, discussions of tidal patterns, deep-sea acoustic anomalies, and the necessity of stricter international regulations regarding large marine predators. These letters were his way of staying connected to the visceral reality of the event, translating the horror into quantifiable science. Brody would read them slowly, often tracing the printed words with a calloused finger, understanding that Hooper was building a scientific fortress against the very chaos that had almost claimed them. Brody envied that clean, academic closure Hooper could pursue, the ability to reframe near-death as publishable data. The town's official cleanup was an exercise in denial. The local businesses frantically repainted, replaced faded signage, and loudly advertised shark-free waters. A guarantee that Brody knew was nothing more than wishful thinking printed on cheap flyers. He walked past the boardwalk one afternoon and overheard two teenagers joking about the movie they'd heard was being made about the incident, completely detached from the actual terror. This casual commodification of their trauma sickened him. He was no longer the chief fighting an immediate crisis. He was the reluctant historian guarding an inconvenient, dangerous truth that everyone else was eager to pave over. His tenure was becoming less about keeping people safe and more about ensuring that when the next great white inevitably swam into the shallows, people wouldn't be entirely unprepared for the sheer, terrifying scale of what they faced. Brody knew his retirement, whenever it came, would not be a transition to leisure, but a quiet, lifelong anxiety attack endured somewhere far from the salt spray. Brody's final, unofficial act of stewardship involved a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his public demeanor. He stopped trying to convince Mayor Vaughn. He stopped arguing about beach closures based on hunches or fear. Instead, he became relentlessly bureaucratic, pushing for the documentation of every minor marine sighting, every strange ripple, every unexplained absence of local fish stocks. He used the weight of his office not for grand pronouncements, but for the meticulous accumulation of data that, if viewed together, painted a far grimmer picture than any single attack ever could. This was his revenge against the town's willful ignorance, to bury them in objective, undeniable facts that could not be spun by the Chamber of Commerce. Ellen, recognizing this new, quiet determination, began to support him in small, practical ways. She stopped pushing for the escape inland and instead focused on fortifying their home against the external world. She installed heavier curtains, ensured the well was deep and clean, and nurtured a small, fiercely guarded vegetable garden in the back, a tangible connection to solid, non-aquatic life. Their shared silence in the evenings became less fraught with unspoken dread and more like the quiet understanding between two survivors who had seen the same battlefield and knew exactly what the other carried. There was a profound respect forged in shared near-loss, a bond stronger than any they had enjoyed during the carefree honeymoon phase of their move to the coast. Hooper's final communication wasn't a letter, but a thick, leather-bound volume of deep-sea photography. Inside, tucked between glossy images of bioluminescent life forms, was a handwritten inscription, "To Brody, for remembering what the numbers can't teach us." It was the scientist acknowledging the limits of his own expertise, a rare and meaningful concession. Brody kept the book on his desk, a constant reminder that while data could track a threat, only courage, or perhaps just luck, could defeat it when it emerged from the abyss. Hooper had moved on to bigger oceans and grander research vessels, but the ghost of the orca and Quint's desperate final moments would forever link him to the reluctant chief of Amity. As the cold truly set in, the beaches grew desolate. Brody would often drive down late at night, parking his cruiser far from the sand, and simply sit, listening to the winter surf. The ocean was less inviting now, stripped of its summer glamour, revealing its true, cold power. He was no longer afraid of the water. Fear had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect, a recognition of an immutable hierarchy. He knew with the certainty of a man who has survived the impossible that the sea did not care about zoning laws, tourism, or the lives of men. It simply was. And Brody, the urban transplant who never truly learned to love the water, had finally carved out a place for himself on this unforgiving island, not as a native, but as its dedicated, weary sentinel, forever watching the vast, indifferent blue. The winter winds whipping off the Atlantic brought with them a cleansing chill, scouring the superficial grime of the tourist season from Amity Island. For Brody, this austerity was a balm. The crowds were gone, and with them went the incessant pressure to project an image of carefree safety. He felt, for the first time since the attacks, that he could breathe without anticipating the next headline. His focus narrowed to the internal workings of his small department, where the men, humbled by the sheer scale of the tragedy, treated him with a deference bordering on reverence, a respect he found almost as burdensome as the previous skepticism. They saw the outcome. He saw the mechanism of near annihilation. Ellen, noticing the lessening of his hypervigilance when he was inside the house, began to tentatively reintroduce elements of normalcy. They started hosting small dinners again, inviting only the few townspeople who had shown genuine, unvarnished empathy during the crisis, those who had lost loved ones or hadn't publicly demanded the beaches stay open. These gatherings were subdued affairs, discussions rarely straying toward the sea, instead focusing on practical community matters, a way of rebuilding the human connection that the shark's presence had severed. Brody found himself participating again, his laughter occasionally breaking through the reserve, a sound that still felt foreign, but welcome. Yet, the sea remained an active character in their lives. Brody developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of local tidal charts and weather predictions, not to prevent emergencies, but to predict when the water would be most turbulent, most active, most likely to reveal something unwanted. He had internalized Quint's obsession, replacing the hunter's vengeful drive with a sober administrative necessity. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was simply learning the enemy's schedule. He even kept Hooper's final photography book near his bedside, sometimes studying the alien beauty of the deep-sea organisms, creatures that lived under pressures that would instantly crush a human, finding a strange kinship with their harsh, unforgiving existence. The greatest irony was that Brody, the man who had moved to Amity to escape the crushing pressures of the city, now found his peace not in tranquility, but in the active management of an ever-present existential threat. He realized that true safety wasn't the absence of danger, but the continuous, exhausting vigilance against it. He was the permanent sentinel on the edge of the known world, the man who had stared into the abyss and, rather than blink, had decided to build a slightly taller wall. The island would never be truly safe, but as long as he was there, watching the horizon, it would be respected. And in that begrudging respect, Brody finally found a grim, sustainable purpose. The encroaching winter solidified Brody's role as Amity's necessary Cassandra. He was no longer the nervous transplant. He was the resident authority on the unseen terror. His official car, the standard issue police sedan, now often sat parked silently near the high tide line, its dome light occasionally illuminating the spray-soaked sand, a silent vigil that had replaced the boisterous activity of summer. He carried a thermos of bitter, lukewarm coffee, mirroring the lukewarm comfort he found in his situation. The townspeople, having survived their economic scare, now viewed him with a blend of grudging gratitude and mild superstition, treating him like a local oracle whose warnings, though inconvenient, were now too costly to ignore entirely. Ellen, recognizing that her husband had found a fragile equilibrium rooted in his continued watchfulness, ceased trying to pull him away from the coastline. Instead, she became his anchor to the domestic world, the part of life that still followed predictable schedules and required him to put down the binoculars and eat dinner. She focused on maintaining the warmth inside their home, creating a sanctuary that was deliberately landlocked, insulated by sturdy walls and the low, comforting heat of a wood-burning stove. Their conversations settled into an unspoken rhythm. She kept the interior world running smoothly, allowing him the mental space to manage the external threat. Their love was no longer about shared dreams of idyllic escape, but a mutual, pragmatic alliance against the persistent entropy symbolized by the sea. The town's superficial attempt at moving on was most evident in the way they spoke of Quint. He was rapidly being mythologized, a heroic casualty of a freak natural event, his darker, perhaps obsessive tendencies conveniently pruned away by the passing months. Brody bristled at this sanitization. He knew Quint's final dive was a suicide mission wrapped in bravado, yet he also recognized the necessary, if tragic, purity of that commitment. Brody kept a small, tarnished brass compass, salvaged from the debris Hooper had allowed him to collect, tucked away in his desk drawer. It didn't point north anymore. It spun listlessly, a perfect metaphor for the chaos that had upended his own navigational systems. Hooper, through his academic success, occasionally sent postcards from increasingly distant, sunnier locales, the Galapagos, the Great Barrier Reef, but his tone remained consistent, professional, respectful, but fundamentally distant. He was charting new frontiers of knowledge, while Brody was left guarding the old, violent boundary. Brody understood that Hooper couldn't stay. The raw, immediate danger that had initially galvanized the scientist was now just an entry in a peer-reviewed journal. Brody, conversely, was bound to the place where the theoretical became brutally, physically, real. He was the only one left who felt the cold water's proximity, not as a suggestion of a vacation spot, but as the constant, low-frequency hum of potential disaster, a sound only he, the unwilling sentinel, could truly hear. The cinematic experience of Tragedi Serangan Hiu Raksasa, Nonton Online, despite its perhaps somewhat hyperbolic title, suggesting a straightforward creature feature, reveals a surprisingly textured engagement with themes of environmental hubris and the relentless power of nature when pushed too far. The film, which seems to draw heavily on the legacy of blockbuster shark narratives initiated decades prior, carves out its own niche, primarily through its reliance on localized tension, rather than purely gargantuan spectacle, though the latter is certainly present. One compelling aspect is the depiction of the central human conflict preceding the aquatic disaster. We observe characters, often local scientists or perhaps developers. It's frequently difficult to precisely delineate their motivations in these types of narratives, who seem driven by a singular, almost reckless pursuit of discovery or profit, frequently encroaching upon established marine ecosystems. This mirrors anxieties prevalent in contemporary ecological discourse, the consequences of disrupting delicate balances, often with an underlying current of "we knew better, but proceeded anyway." The film uses the inevitable shark attacks not merely as jump scares, but as a brutal, almost biblical consequence of this overreach. The visual language employed during the action sequences suggests an influence from directors who excel at visceral, claustrophobic tension, perhaps leaning on the techniques honed by filmmakers who mastered suspense in confined spaces. When the shark, and it is indeed presented as unusually large and intelligent, begins its assault. The camera work often prioritizes the victim's perspective, emphasizing the sudden transition from the presumed safety of the water's surface to the terrifying, murky depths. This choice humanizes the terror, grounding the spectacle in relatable panic, rather than just showcasing monster movie physics. Considering the implied cast, if we were to project potential inspirations for the central human figures, one might see echoes of actors known for their grounded portrayals of professionals facing insurmountable odds, perhaps individuals whose previous work involved detailed technical roles, lending an air of authenticity to their initial, perhaps futile, attempts at control or containment. The narrative requires actors capable of conveying both intellectual capability and sheer primal fear. A protagonist, perhaps a marine biologist, wrestling with an ethical dilemma stemming from her past research, maybe a collaboration that went awry, would carry the thematic weight well. Think of the quiet intensity of someone who understands the science behind the threat intimately, making their fear more profound than a simple tourist's panic. The underlying inspiration for the creature design itself likely fuses classic cinematic apex predators with modern anxieties about biodiversity loss. This isn't just a big shark, it feels engineered by the plot, a product of unnatural selection or an extreme environmental anomaly. The film suggests that nature, when subjected to immense stress, responds with an equally extreme countermeasure. The sheer size, which pushes the boundaries of biological plausibility, serves a metaphorical function. It represents the overwhelming scale of the environmental debt humanity is accumulating. In essence, Tragedi Serangan Hiu Raksasa, Nonton Online functions less as a pure monster romp and more as a cautionary tale wrapped in action cinema clothing. It leverages established genre tropes, the isolated location, the skeptical authority figure, the inevitable escalation, but tempers them with moments of genuine dread rooted in the idea that the true monster might be the imbalance we ourselves have introduced into the world. The effectiveness lies in making the audience feel complicit in the destruction that unleashes the predator. The emotional resonance of the film hinges significantly on how effectively the screenplay develops the supporting cast, those individuals who are not scientists or villains, but rather the everyday inhabitants caught in the crossfire. We often see the initial dismissiveness from local authorities, a character archetype familiar from many disaster films, who view the early warnings of unusual oceanic activity as mere hysteria or the exaggeration of overzealous academics. This skeptic, perhaps a seasoned harbor master whose entire life has been defined by his understanding of the local tides and the predictable nature of the sea, embodies the stubborn resistance to change, the refusal to acknowledge a threat that lies outside his established framework of reality. His eventual terror, when faced with irrefutable evidence of the shark's destructive capability, provides a crucial emotional anchor for the audience. If the hardened local can be broken, then no one is safe. The film gains depth when it focuses on the character arcs related to familial connection amidst chaos. Imagine a scenario where the protagonist, the driven marine biologist, is not just racing against time to save the town, but simultaneously trying to reach a younger sibling or child trapped in the encroaching danger zone. This immediately elevates the stakes from a generalized ecological threat to a deeply personal, immediate crisis. The biologist's expertise, which initially serves to define her as competent, now becomes a source of agonizing frustration. She knows precisely how the creature operates, yet her knowledge offers no immediate antidote to brute force and instinct. The The quiet desperation etched on her face during radio silences or moments of near misses speaks volumes, suggesting a career dedicated to understanding and preserving life, now focused solely on preventing one specific, irreplaceable loss. Furthermore, the cinematography surrounding the creature's appearances often seems to deliberately echo shots from classic suspense cinema, perhaps paying homage to Hitchcock's reliance on unseen terror, only to then violently shatter that restraint with monstrous reality. When the shark is lurking just beneath the surface, the film uses long, unbroken shots of shimmering water, a surface that is simultaneously beautiful and utterly opaque, to build unbearable suspense. The transition from this quiet dread to the sudden explosive violence of the attack is executed with such jarring speed that it forces an involuntary physical reaction from the viewer. This isn't just about gore, it's about the instantaneous erasure of perceived safety. The implied background of the film's antagonists, those responsible for the industrial activity that perhaps disturbed the deep, often paints them with a veneer of corporate slickness. But the film thankfully avoids making them one-dimensional mustache twirlers. They are more likely driven by quarterly reports and shareholder satisfaction, illustrating how institutional indifference can be just as destructive as active malice. Their eventual comeuppance, if it occurs, is often framed not as heroic justice, but as tragic irony. Their attempts to control or exploit the environment result in their own undoing by the very forces they sought to master. This critique of unchecked capitalism intersecting with natural resources feels very deliberate, suggesting that the real tragedy is not the shark itself, but the systemic blindness that invited its arrival. The entire narrative structure thus becomes a meditation on accountability. The film's success in generating lasting impact relies heavily on its sound design, moving beyond typical orchestral swells to incorporate the terrifying acoustics of the deep. The underwater sequences are particularly effective, characterized by a suffocating low-frequency thrumming, a constant auditory reminder of the immense, unseen presence beneath the surface. This soundscape often drowns out human dialogue or panicked cries, effectively isolating the characters in their terror and underscoring the primal nature of the threat, a force that operates entirely outside the realm of human communication. When the shark breaches the surface, the sound shifts dramatically to a violent, tearing rush of water, a sonic shockwave that mirrors the visual disruption of calm. This auditory palette suggests the influence of sound supervisors who understand that fear is often heard before it is fully seen, echoing the meticulous auditory construction found in high-tension thriller productions. Emotionally, the film navigates the delicate balance between stoicism and raw panic, often showcasing the breakdown of professional composure. Consider the seasoned rescue diver, whose career history likely involves decades of controlled, methodical responses to maritime emergencies. When confronted by this anomalous predator, their practiced movements become jerky, their commands choked with uncharacteristic urgency. This character serves as a barometer for the escalating absurdity of the situation. If the professional whose job it is to remain calm under pressure succumbs to terror, the audience knows the situation has surpassed the realm of manageable disaster and entered existential threat territory. Their eventual sacrifice, if one is included, is made poignant by the contrast between their disciplined past and their frantic final moments. The environmental commentary deepens when the film perhaps hints at the shark's altered behavior being a reaction to unseen contaminants or unnatural noise pollution introduced by the human activities in question. This shifts the narrative focus slightly away from simple revenge and towards ecological defense mechanism. If the shark is reacting to pain or disorientation caused by drilling or sonic testing, its aggression is framed as a desperate, albeit catastrophic, plea for survival. This nuance requires the audience to engage critically. Are we witnessing an attack or a defense by the true indigenous resident of that space? The script must handle this ambiguity carefully, perhaps through the hesitant observations of the lead scientist who begins to see patterns that defy standard biological explanation. Visually, beyond the immediate action, the film subtly uses color grading to reflect the story's descent. The initial scenes near the coastline might be bathed in warm, almost idyllic tones, suggesting the false security of a tourist haven or prosperous coastal town. As the attacks escalate and the focus moves further offshore or into deeper waters, the palette drains, adopting cold blues and oppressive greens, effectively turning the ocean into a suffocating alien environment. This deliberate shift in visual temperature mirrors the character's internal emotional states, moving from optimism to bleak fatalism, cementing the idea that crossing certain invisible lines results in a loss of humanity's comfortable, sunlit world. The overall effect is a sustained piece of filmmaking that uses the guise of a creature feature to explore the inescapable consequences of human arrogance against the backdrop of an indifferent, yet powerfully reactive natural world. The film's narrative arc often hinges on the concept of flawed communication and the inherent difficulty in conveying the scale of true, unprecedented danger to those insulated from the immediate impact. We observe the governmental or military response, typically introduced when the local efforts prove futile. This external intervention often arrives not as salvation, but as a bureaucratic, delayed reaction, hampered by layers of procedure, political posturing, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the biological anomaly they are dealing with. The military commander, often portrayed with steely resolve and a background in conventional warfare, perhaps having served in distant land-based conflicts, insists on applying established protocols, containment via conventional weaponry, assessment through remote surveillance. This character represents the hubris of applying old solutions to new, emergent problems. The tension escalates precisely because the established military thinking fails to account for the shark's intelligence or its sheer, unnatural durability. The human strategy becomes an exercise in futility, evidenced by increasingly desperate maneuvers that only seem to provoke the creature further. A key emotional beat in this phase of the film involves the lead scientist trying to convince the pragmatic military leader that they are dealing with an entity that defies classification. It's not just an aggressive animal, it's an environmental symptom made manifest. The scientist's arguments, rooted in observable data and ecological theory, clash violently with the commander's insistence on chain of command and quantifiable threat metrics. This conflict is profoundly human, illustrating how institutional structures often prioritize established procedure over necessary radical adaptation when faced with the truly unknown. Moreover, the film cleverly utilizes the isolated setting to amplify the psychological toll. Since effective external rescue is clearly unattainable, perhaps due to weather, quarantine zones established too late, or the sheer remoteness of the primary attack zone, the remaining survivors are forced into an increasingly claustrophobic reliance on one another. Friendships fracture under the strain of impossible choices, resources dwindle, and the veneer of civilization rapidly erodes. We see moments where characters, driven by survival instinct, turn on each other, suggesting that the true monster isn't just the leviathan in the water, but the potential for base selfishness within the human spirit when stripped bare of societal safety nets. This darker psychological exploration elevates the film beyond simple monster movie tropes into a more resonant survival drama, where the threat from within becomes almost as compelling as the threat from the deep. The memory of those who succumbed not to teeth, but to panic or betrayal lingers in the silence between attacks. The climax of the film, when all conventional methods of defense have spectacularly failed, often forces the surviving core group, the skeptical scientist, the humbled local expert, and perhaps a lone, resourceful technician, into a final, desperate gambit that necessitates confronting the core of the environmental transgression itself. This final strategy is invariably something unorthodox, perhaps involving exploiting the creature's unique sensitivity, the very characteristic that the initial human exploitation overlooked or intentionally ignored. The technician, often characterized by a gritty, practical skill set, honed through years of maintaining aging coastal infrastructure or deep-sea rigs, a character whose brilliance lies in mechanical ingenuity rather than academic theory, becomes unexpectedly vital. Their moments of triumph are not marked by grand speeches, but by the successful manipulation of complex, often decaying technology under extreme duress. The emotional apex frequently revolves around a necessary sacrifice, a trope common in disaster epics, yet rendered fresh by the context. If the leading scientist must knowingly enter the creature's domain to deploy the solution, their action is framed not as heroic oblivion, but as a calculated atonement. Having perhaps been instrumental, even inadvertently, in the research or development that led to the imbalance, their final act is one of ultimate responsibility. The camera lingers on their focused breathing apparatus, their hands steadying despite internal terror, emphasizing the transition from intellectual struggle to physical necessity. This act strips away the pretense of scholarly distance, grounding the entire scientific endeavor in a visceral life-or-death consequence. The aftermath, if the film grants one, is rarely a triumphant return to normalcy. Instead, the few survivors emerge environmentally traumatized, burdened by knowledge that others will likely choose to ignore. The closing sequence often shows the surviving protagonist staring out at the now deceptively calm ocean, the sun perhaps breaking through the clouds, but the beauty is irrevocably tainted. They are no longer simply researchers or residents. They are witnesses burdened by a terrible truth that conventional society is ill-equipped to handle. This ambiguity, the success of stopping the immediate threat versus the failure to truly change the underlying human behavior, provides the film's most enduring, melancholic comment. The creature is gone, but the sea remains a potent symbol of uncontrollable power, and the uneasy truce between humanity and nature has been brutally renegotiated, leaving a scar on the collective psyche of the survivors that no amount of sunshine can erase. The final lingering shot, often focusing on the vast, seemingly indifferent expanse of the ocean, serves as a potent visual metaphor for the film's ultimate conclusion: nature's long memory and humanity's inherent short-sightedness. The survivors, if they are indeed the lead scientist and the resourceful technician, carry the weight of the ordeal in their body language, a perpetual slight tremor in their hands, an unwillingness to look directly at the water's edge. This internalized trauma eclipses any physical recovery. The scientist, having wrestled with the intellectual implications of ecological disaster, now faces the profound existential question of whether humanity is capable of learning from such devastation, or if the cycle of encroachment and consequence is fated to repeat itself. Consider the character arc of the local community members who initially dismissed the warnings. Their reintegration, if shown, is marked by a haunted silence. The harborside town, once bustling with the commerce that fueled the very disturbances causing the crisis, is now characterized by an unnerving stillness. Fishermen might mend nets with a mechanical slowness, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, not for profit, but for threat. This subtle societal shift suggests that the tragedy hasn't just claimed lives. It has fundamentally altered the relationship between the community and its livelihood, replacing confidence with profound, deep-seated superstition regarding the depths. The film's pacing in these final moments often slows dramatically, forcing the audience to inhabit the survivor's exhaustion. Where the action sequences were defined by rapid cuts and adrenaline, the denouement is characterized by long, almost static takes, emphasizing the emptiness left behind. This deliberate deceleration allows the emotional fallout to settle, transforming the preceding spectacle into a heavy, sobering reflection. The silence, once momentarily terrifying during the shark's hunting sequences, now becomes pervasive, signifying the loss of innocence and the end of comfortable denial. Even the rescue teams, when they finally arrive, perhaps too late to matter for the immediate fight, are treated with a detached suspicion by the survivors. They represent the outside world, the world that didn't understand the immediacy of the horror, and their well-meaning inquiries and bureaucratic reports feel hollow against the reality of what has transpired. The narrative subtly suggests that true understanding and salvation only came from those who were physically present in the maelstrom, a final validation of the marginalized experts whose warnings were initially ignored. Ultimately, Tragedi Serangan Hiu Raksasa. Nonton Online uses the spectacle of the giant shark not as an end in itself, but as a terrifying catalyst that strips away layers of human artifice, revealing the stark, unforgiving reality of ecological consequence and the fragile nature of perceived dominion over the natural world. The final image is not of victory, but of exhausted, weary endurance. The very air in the survivors' immediate aftermath seems thick with the salt spray of the ocean and the metallic tang of fear, a sensory residue that no amount of scrubbing can fully remove. The film subtly employs the visual motif of water damage, damp spots on salvaged documents, the slow drip from damaged structural supports, to suggest that the terror has seeped into the very foundations of their physical world. This pervasive dampness acts as a constant, low-grade reminder of the realm that nearly consumed them. The psychological landscape of the remaining community is marked by an almost superstitious avoidance of routine. Children, if any remain central to the narrative, might refuse to play near fountains or even large bathtubs. Their early developmental stages now imprinted with a primal fear of submersion. The adults, particularly those who lost loved ones in the water, might display an unnerving hypervigilance, compulsively checking water levels, avoiding rainstorms, or even drinking bottled water exclusively, symbolizing a profound break in trust with the most basic element of life. This transformation from a coastal populace, defined by their intimacy with the sea, to one actively alienated from it, is perhaps the most profound long-term casualty of the rampage. If the film introduces a final, symbolic antagonist, perhaps a surviving corporate executive brought back to face scrutiny, their appearance is intentionally muted. They are not grandly apprehended, rather they might appear isolated, sitting alone in a sterile office, unable to process the elemental scale of the destruction they funded. Their downfall is bureaucratic and internal, a quiet failure in the face of nature's definitive physical refutation of their spreadsheets. This contrasts sharply with the visceral, immediate obliteration faced by those directly in the shark's path. The film suggests that the abstract violence of commerce, while damaging, lacks the terrifying finality of nature's direct retribution. The sound design in the closing moments often contrasts the lingering echoes of the chaos. A high-pitched ringing in an ear that survived the sonic booms of the military engagement, perhaps, with an almost deafening natural silence. Yet, woven into this silence are manufactured sonic cues. The distant, almost subliminal sound of a large vessel engine or the rhythmic clang of a buoy, sounds that once represented safety and navigation, now triggering instantaneous anxiety responses in the protagonists. This demonstrates how the experience has permanently rewired their auditory perception, turning the familiar acoustic environment into a minefield of potential triggers. The final shot, therefore, is not just of the water, but often includes the figure of the surviving scientist or technician, positioned against the horizon, implying a self-imposed exile or guardianship. Their future is not about resuming a normal life, but about perpetual vigilance, becoming the reluctant keepers of a terrible secret. They are permanently marked as the bridge between the hubris of the human world and the indifferent, immense power of the deep, suggesting that their only remaining purpose is to warn the next generation, a task they know, with grim certainty, will likely be futile. The tragedy the film implies is not that the shark attacked, but that humanity will inevitably forget why. The lingering atmosphere of unresolved ecological trauma often necessitates a brief, perhaps uncomfortable epilogue detailing the official investigation, a narrative device used to frame the events within a structure the wider, untouched world can process. This section of the film typically features governmental inquiries led by detached officials, individuals whose careers were built on managing predictable crises, not confronting mythological-scale biological anomalies. Their reports, often glimpsed in fragmented scenes on bureaucratic desks or read aloud with dry monotone, attempt to sanitize the horror, reducing the massive shark to a quantifiable threat, perhaps labeling it a previously undocumented, aggressive megaseal, or attributing its size to a localized deep-sea thermal vent phenomenon. This bureaucratic whitewashing serves as the final, maddening insult to the survivors. The lead scientist, if she is alive, is invariably the primary target of this official scrutiny. Her testimony, delivered in sterile hearing rooms under harsh lighting, contrasts starkly with the chaotic, visceral reality she experienced. She attempts to convey the interconnectedness of the deep-sea ecosystem disturbance and the creature's emergence, but her nuanced explanations are repeatedly met with requests for simpler, actionable data points. Her frustration boils over, not in shouting, but in a chilling resignation, recognizing that the systems meant to protect them are structurally incapable of acknowledging truths that fall outside established budgetary or scientific parameters. This scene highlights the gulf between lived through experience, and mediated political understanding. Furthermore, the film might introduce a subplot concerning the attempted cleanup or the quarantine zone's dismantling. Even in this phase, human fallibility and greed manifest. Perhaps scavengers or unauthorized salvage operations attempt to recover valuable wreckage or, more disturbingly, tissue samples from the creature, driven by the misguided hope of profit or sensationalism. This minor resurgence of recklessness proves that the central lesson has not been learned. the temptation to exploit the remnants of disaster remains potent. This near repeat of the initial hubris underscores the cyclical nature of the tragedy the film has explored. The technician, whose practical brilliance saved the day, often retreats entirely from public view, perhaps taking up a solitary existence, maintaining obsolete navigational beacons far from populated shores. This retreat is not cowardice, but self-preservation. The noise of civilization, the chatter of media attempting to sensationalize the monster, is unbearable. They are the living embodiment of the film's caution. Some knowledge is too heavy to share, and some scars are best hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The final scenes emphasizing their isolation cement the idea that while the immediate physical danger has passed, the psychological victory belongs to the silence and the deep, which reclaims its witnesses. The film subtly suggests that the very geography of the disaster zone becomes cursed, transforming from a source of livelihood and recreation into a forbidden, almost mythic space in the collective memory. Maps might still show the locations of submerged towns or lost vessels, but the local navigation charts will now carry unofficial, hand-drawn warnings, crude sketches, or symbolic markings that transcend official governmental signage. These are the oral traditions of survival, passed between the few who understand the reality lurking beneath the waves. The film can convey this through a sequence where a younger character, perhaps the child of a survivor, dares to approach the old docks, only to be violently pulled back by an older relative whose entire demeanor shifts from weary resignation to protective ferocity at the mere proximity of the water's edge. This redefinition of the landscape extends to the very rhythm of daily life. The community might adopt new, localized superstitions concerning the tides or the weather, rituals performed before sunrise, or specific ways of disposing of refuse to appease the unseen forces they disturbed. These seemingly irrational behaviors, when viewed through the lens of the film's preceding events, read not as superstition, but as profoundly logical, albeit desperate, attempts to re-establish a respectful distance from nature's boundaries. The audience, privy to the true scale of the threat, understands that these rituals are the only defenses left now, that technology and authority have failed. The narrative closure, devoid of traditional triumph, often circles back to the fate of the creature itself, or rather, the ambiguity surrounding it. Did they truly kill the immense shark, or merely drive it back into deeper, less accessible trenches? A final, tantalizing piece of evidence, perhaps an unusually large, perfectly preserved tooth found washed ashore weeks later, or a sonar reading that quickly vanishes, is often presented to the lead scientist. This final clue refutes any easy conclusion of victory, leaving the implication that the giant predator was simply a symptom, one wave in a larger, recurring pattern of natural response. It is a final, quiet, intellectual confrontation, confirming that the ecological debt remains unpaid. The overall emotional trajectory of Tragedi Serangan Hiu Raksasa Nonton Online is thus a descent from action thriller excitement into profound, almost philosophical melancholy. The true horror isn't the visceral attack, but the sustained aftermath, the quiet realization that the human species' capacity for self-deception regarding its environmental impact is boundless. The film positions its survivors not as heroes who won a fight, but as Cassandra figures, forever scarred by witnessing a truth too immense and inconvenient for the wider world to ever fully embrace. They are left guarding a shoreline that is beautiful once more, yet forever charged with the memory of primordial rage. The lingering impression the film leaves is deeply tied to the concept of contaminated memory. For the survivors, every moment of beauty in the coastal environment is now overlaid with the potential for annihilation. Imagine the lead scientist, now withdrawn, perhaps attempting to resume academic work, but finding that textbooks and peer-reviewed journals feel utterly irrelevant against the sheer, undeniable truth of chaos she witnessed. Her notebooks are no longer filled with hypothesis, but with frantic sketches of the creature's movements, attempts to map an intelligence that defied scientific categorization. Her colleagues who seek to analyze the footage professionally often miss the emotional context, the sheer sonic violence, the smell of ozone and blood that permeated the air, reducing her trauma to mere data points on a screen. This intellectual isolation compounds her personal grief. The film might subtly use the motif of reflected light on water in the final acts. Where initially the sunlight sparkling on the surface was inviting, now the reflection is distorted, shattered by the slightest ripple, mimicking the protagonist's fractured mental state. This visual language suggests that even the most fundamental elements of the natural world have become untrustworthy observers of human folly. The ocean no longer merely holds a threat. It actively mirrors the survivor's persistent internal instability. Consider the technician's fate further. Their retreat into solitude isn't just about avoiding media, it's about avoiding the very societal mechanisms, the need for categorization, the demand for easy closure that the government investigation epitomizes. Perhaps the technician is found maintaining an automated weather station on a desolate offshore platform, finding solace only in the predictable mechanical turning of machinery, a world entirely divorced from the messy, unpredictable biology that nearly destroyed them. Their existence becomes a living testament to the idea that survival requires an exit from the very civilization that caused the problem. The narrative's commentary on fame and exploitation culminates if the film briefly cuts to a major metropolitan area months later. News channels are running breathless, sensationalized documentaries about the Great Deep Sea Terror, often featuring poorly rendered CGI recreations and interviews with opportunistic commentators who were nowhere near the danger. The survivors, watching these distorted accounts on a small, static-ridden television, react not with anger, but with a profound weariness. This scene underscores that the external world is already commodifying their near-death experience, stripping it of its vital ecological warning in favor of cheap thrills. The true tragedy is that the spectacular nature of the attack guarantees it will be remembered as a monster movie, not as a dire environmental wake-up call. The film, by refusing a neat Hollywood ending, insists that the real burden is carrying the unshareable, inconvenient truth long after the cameras have stopped rolling. The film's enduring power lies in its refusal to offer catharsis through finality. Instead, it concludes with an atmosphere of perpetual preparedness. The survivors are not granted peace, but rather a shift in their baseline existence, a state of permanent low-grade alertness. This vigilance manifests in small, telling habits, always positioning themselves with their backs to an open space, never walking alone near large bodies of water, and a marked aversion to silence, often preferring the drone of machinery or static over the quiet that recalls the moments just before the first assault. This internalized hyperarousal suggests that the true victory of the apex predator was not its physical destruction, but its success in fundamentally altering human perception and behavior. This psychological scarring provides rich ground for character study, especially for the younger generation who might have witnessed the events as children. If a teenager is shown years later, perhaps attempting to enter marine biology studies, mirroring the career path of the surviving scientist, their enthusiasm is tempered by a profound, almost morbid fascination with the abyssal zones. Their pursuit of knowledge is not driven by curiosity or discovery, but by a compulsive need to map the enemy's territory, to understand the depth not as a frontier, but as a potential grave. They seek control through exhaustive knowledge, a direct reaction against the helplessness their parents experienced. The physical setting itself often undergoes a strange purification, albeit a morbid one. Where once the town relied on tourism, drawn to the pristine waters, now the beaches are subtly abandoned. The former beauty is now seen as a deceptive mask. If a new structure is built, a monument perhaps, or a research center dedicated to deep-sea monitoring, it is invariably constructed using massive, over-engineered materials, symbolizing a human attempt to build defenses against the fluid, uncontainable force of nature. These new structures feel heavy, defensive, and utterly joyless, contrasting sharply with the light, open architecture that characterized the town before the tragedy. Ultimately, the film functions as a slow-burn ecological allegory, wrapped in the skin of a creature feature. The giant shark becomes less a biological entity and more a tangible manifestation of unchecked systemic failure. The collective, monstrous weight of disregarded scientific warnings, corporate short-term thinking, and societal apathy towards environmental degradation. The final emotional note struck is one of humility born from devastation. Humanity in this telling is not the rightful master of the planet, but a tenant whose lease can be summarily revoked when the landlord, in this case the deep ocean, decides the rent in the form of ecological stability is past due. The enduring tragedy is that such a clear, brutal lesson appears insufficient to guarantee future restraint. The final, chilling aspect of the film's lasting impact resides in the lingering suspicion that the creature was merely the harbinger, not the ultimate threat. This thought often plagues the lead scientist during moments of solitude, perhaps while reviewing archived sonar data that show signatures far larger, far deeper, or exhibiting patterns of movement that defy even the aberrant behavior of the creature they battled. The film hints that the industrial activities, the deep-sea drilling, or the seismic testing didn't just provoke one large animal. They may have inadvertently breached a threshold, awakened something ancient, or destabilized a complex, unseen biome that holds far greater and more numerous entities. This sense of impending, layered doom is perfectly captured in the demeanor of the few remaining grizzled fishermen, those who survived by being on land during the worst of the attacks. They refuse to speak about the creature they saw, instead focusing their anxiety on the silence of the seafloor. Their fear shifts from the known predator to the unknown void. They whisper about strange lights on the horizon that aren't ships, or anomalous pressure readings on their aging gauges. They represent the collective subconscious of the coastal community, recognizing that the ecosystem they relied upon has been permanently corrupted, and what they faced was perhaps only the first, most visible manifestation of the deep's displeasure. Emotionally, the film concludes by denying the audience the satisfaction of a clear victory against nature. The scientist's quiet acceptance of this ambiguity is perhaps her final, most harrowing character development. She understands that definitive proof is impossible. The deep will not yield its secrets readily, and any further investigation will only invite more destruction. Her role shifts from active defender to reluctant oracle, forever haunted by the possibility that the terrifying giant they fought was simply the shallow end of the problem. Her legacy is not the discovery of a new species, but the painful acquisition of knowledge that proves humanity's domain is far smaller and more conditional than previously assumed. Visually, the final frames often contrast the dark, impenetrable blue of the deep ocean with the stark, bleached out emptiness of the sun scorched shoreline. This juxtaposition emphasizes the psychological rift. The surface world, with its fleeting sunlight and false security, feels flimsy and temporary compared to the eternal, crushing reality beneath the waves. The camera holds on this horizon, a thin, vibrating line separating two mutually exclusive realities, suggesting that humanity has been permanently relegated to the fragile shore, forever looking out at the vast majority of the planet with a new, profound, and terrified respect. The narrative closes not with a bang, but with the cold, slow realization that the sea has simply retreated, waiting patiently for the next careless intrusion. The film's closing credits often employ a final, insidious sound design element to cement this feeling of unresolved dread. As the names scroll against a black screen, the low-frequency thrumming, the constant auditory reminder of the unseen presence from the underwater sequences, is slowly reintroduced. Played at a volume so low, it sits just at the edge of conscious perception. It's not loud enough to be recognized immediately as a threat, but just present enough to keep the viewer's heart rate subtly elevated long after they have left the theater. This auditory haunting suggests that the threat wasn't neutralized. It was merely pushed back into its native element, its acoustic signature persisting in the environment the audience now returns to. This persistent soundscape directly impacts the characterization of the survivors into the film's implied future. The scientist, having withdrawn from official channels, might be seen in a final, silent montage, perhaps monitoring global seismic activity from a makeshift, secluded observatory. She doesn't look triumphant. She appears thin, almost brittle, sustained only by the necessity of her self-appointed watch. Her eyes, once bright with academic curiosity, are now perpetually narrowed, as if constantly trying to resolve distant, blurry forms on a screen or in the periphery of her vision. She is the Cassandra who has seen the future and can only observe its slow, inevitable approach. The local community, meanwhile, might exhibit a collective, quiet refusal to embrace modern technology for fear of amplifying the very signals that might attract unwanted attention. Their fishing boats become conspicuously old-fashioned, relying on mechanical navigation and silence rather than sophisticated, potentially detectable sonar arrays. This regression isn't a return to simplicity. It's a tactical surrender to the known constraints of the pre-disaster world, a desperate attempt to become acoustically invisible to whatever else might dwell in the depths. Their faces are etched with a quiet resentment towards progress, viewing every new technological advancement as another potential lure for annihilation. The film's ultimate emotional signature is one of profound ecological melancholy, not anger. The rage has burned out, leaving only the cold ash of understanding. The absence of a grand, triumphant final battle against the creature itself is crucial. It denies the audience the satisfaction of conquering nature. Instead, the survivors inherit a world where they are merely tolerated tenants. The ocean is no longer a resource or a mystery. It is a vast, powerful, and ultimately unknowable entity whose patience is demonstrably limited. The true horror isn't the shark's teeth, but the irreversible loss of humanity's comfortable illusion of dominion, a lesson learned at catastrophic cost, and one the world as evidenced by the bureaucratic inquiries, seems determined to immediately forget. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. If you enjoy our content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Today, we're going to be discussing the film Sulih Suara, Tragedi Serangan Hiu Raksasa, nonton online. The air hung thick and salty around Amity Island, a picture postcard of New England charm that belied the churning anxieties beneath its surface. We meet Chief Martin Brody, a man whose past we sense is rooted firmly in the concrete canyons of a city, perhaps New York, where the water was something to be avoided, not embraced. Now he's trying to adapt to this sleepy coastal community, a transition made difficult by his inherent unease with the ocean, a classic case of the transplanted urbanite confronting nature's raw indifference. His wife, Ellen, tries to bridge the gap, but the real tension surfaces when a young woman's late-night swim ends in a brutal, unseen attack. Brody, ever the cautious administrator, immediately wants the beaches closed. He envisions headlines, lawsuits, the end of the lucrative summer season. But Mayor Larry Vaughn, a man whose entire identity seems tied to the success of the tourist trade, waves away the concerns. Vaughn, perhaps accustomed to the minor skirmishes of local politics, treats the incident as a regrettable accident, an unfortunate, isolated event. His denial is palpable, thick with the smell of tanning lotion and impending profit. Then the second attack comes, this time claiming a local man who, ironically, had been exploring the wreckage of a sunken vessel nearby, perhaps seeking forgotten treasures, or simply a thrill. This escalates things beyond mere rumor. Brody finds an unlikely ally in Matt Hooper, a young, sharp, and incredibly wealthy oceanographer. Hooper represents the intellectual, scientific approach. He's eager, equipped with the latest sonar equipment, and bursting with academic fervor, having likely studied marine biology at an institution so prestigious it doesn't need naming. He knows what they are dealing with, a great white, a perfect massive predator. Brody and Hooper push for immediate action, but Vaughn remains resistant, fearing bad press more than bad consequences. He commissions a shark hunter, Quint, a character who steps out of a different era entirely. Quint is the embodiment of grizzled sea lore, a man who speaks in nautical metaphors and carries the scars of past battles, real or imagined, with the sea. His famous monologue about the sinking of the Indianapolis isn't just storytelling, it's a psychological profile etched in trauma, revealing a man who believes he understands the ocean's malice because he's looked into its abyss before. His boat, the Orca, is a beautiful, battered relic, a testament to a time when men fought sea monsters with harpoons rather than sensors. When the first tangible evidence, a massive, jagged tooth, is presented, Vaughn is finally forced to concede. The beaches are closed, but the damage is done. Hooper, driven by his scientific imperative, mounts an underwater cage expedition, wanting to document the beast. This initial foray proves that their preparation, while sophisticated, is still insufficient against true instinct. The shark demolishes the cage, nearly claiming Hooper, confirming that this is not just an animal, it's a force of nature made flesh, impervious to their modern protections. Brody, realizing the official response is inadequate, pressures Vaughn one last time, leading to the inevitable confrontation. The three men, the reluctant cop, the passionate scientist, and the vengeful hunter, set out on the Orca. The ensuing voyage is a masterclass in escalating tension. Quint, fueled by rum and resentment toward the shark, steers them further from shore, intentionally escalating the hunt into a personal vendetta. Hooper, though knowledgeable, becomes increasingly frustrated by Quint's almost superstitious approach. Brody, caught between these two extremes, suffers from seasickness and a growing sense of dread. The inevitable encounter is terrifying. The shark is revealed not as a CGI spectacle, but as a looming, utterly massive presence that dwarfs their vessel. It picks apart the orca with chilling efficiency, treating their efforts like a child toys with blocks. Quint's bravado cracks under the reality of the monster. His initial confidence dissolves into panicked rage. In a desperate final act, recalling the lessons of the Indianapolis, Quint attempts to dispatch the shark with a depth charge, only to be snatched from the deck, disappearing in the churning water, a grim confirmation of the ocean's ultimate authority. It falls to Brody, the outsider who always knew the danger was real, to finish it. Stripped of the specialized equipment and the archaic weaponry, he relies on primal instinct and the few tools left at hand. Remembering the need to strike where the beast is vulnerable, he finally uses the one weapon they thought wouldn't be necessary, a high-powered rifle loaded with explosive rounds, aiming for the maw. The resulting explosion sends blood into the water, a gruesome punctuation mark to the terror. As they drift back toward Amity, Brody and Hooper, the unlikely survivors, watch the water, knowing that while this specific chapter is closed, the ocean holds countless other indifferent secrets. Brody, gazing back at the fading shoreline, has finally earned his place on the island, not as a guest, but as one who has faced its deepest shadows and lived to tell the tale. The salt spray seemed to cling to Chief Brody's khaki uniform like a persistent accusation. He was a man built for the grid system, for the predictable chaos of city life, not the boundless, untamed expanse that now defined his existence on Amity Island. His anxiety wasn't just about the shark. It was about the loss of control, the constant reminder that nature, unlike city zoning laws, refused to be managed. Ellen, his wife, carried the weight of his unspoken fears, her attempts at domestic normalcy, a fragile shield against the encroaching primal threat. The opening death, that bright summer moment shattered by crimson streaks in the turquoise water, felt to Brody like a personal failure, a bureaucratic oversight he couldn't correct with a memo. Mayor Vaughn, whose smile seemed permanently affixed for the Chamber of Commerce photo ops, operated on a pure, unadulterated faith in the almighty dollar. He wasn't malicious, perhaps, just deeply insulated by his privilege and the endless stream of tourist dollars that lubricated his vision of Amity. To him, the ocean was a backdrop for profitable recreation, not a hunting ground. When the second victim, a local exploring the sunken anonymity of the seabed, was taken, Vaughn's denial hardened into obstinance. He was protecting an illusion, a summer economy built on willful ignorance. Enter Matt Hooper. He arrived smelling faintly of laboratory formaldehyde and wealth, his youthful enthusiasm